In the gilded cage of the Valerius estate, Elena is a ghost in a black uniform. She has spent 3 years polishing silver and perfecting the art of being invisible to the most dangerous man in Sicily, Don Lorenzo. She knows his secrets, but he doesn't even know her last name. Tonight, the air in the study is thick with the scent of mahogany and impending blood. From the doorway, Elena sees what the Don cannot. A shadow detaching itself from the velvet curtains behind his armchair, the cold glint of a suppressed barrel aimed at the back of his head. One scream will get her killed. Silence will leave her splashed in his blood. Leaning down as if to pour his cognac, she presses her lips to his ear, her voice a ghost of a shiver. "Don't turn around. If you move, you're a dead man. If you listen, we might both make it out of this room." In that heartbeat, the invisible Maid becomes the only thing standing between a king and his grave. The Seoul skyline was a jagged crown of neon and glass, and from the 60th floor of the Moretti Kang Tower, Kang Ji-wook owned every shimmering inch of it. To the world outside these reinforced windows, he was the Iron Architect, a man whose heartbeat regulated the city's black market pulse. His office was a cathedral of cold marble and sharp edges, where billion-won deals were sealed with a nod and lives were ended with a whisper. Yet, as the clock struck midnight, the power he wielded felt like nothing more than a heavy shroud. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, his reflection superimposed over the sprawling metropolis, but his eyes weren't on the traffic patterns or the shipping docks. He was looking at the woman sitting in the armchair behind him. Thalassa sat perfectly still, a porcelain doll forgotten in a corner of a palace. Outside, a summer storm lashed against the building, the rain streaking down the glass in frantic, weeping lines. She was watching the water move, her gaze fixed on a single point in the dark air. For 3 years, that gaze had never wavered, never sharpened, and never found him. Ji-wook turned away from the city he had conquered and walked toward her, his heavy footsteps muffled by the silk rug. He knelt at her feet, the sharp crease of his designer trousers hitting the floor. He took her hand. It was cool, limp, and terrifyingly light. "Thalassa," he whispered, his voice a gravelly ghost of the one that commanded armies. She did not blink. Her eyes, the color of a winter sea, remained clouded by a fog he could not pierce. 3 years ago, a shard of lead and a moment of chaos had stolen the woman who used to laugh at his seriousness. Now, she was a ghost inhabiting a living body. Ji-wook looked around the room. Every piece of furniture cost more than a common man earned in a lifetime. The art on the walls was looted from history, and the air was filtered to a perfect, sterile purity. He realized with a sudden, sickening clarity that this penthouse was not a home. It was a museum for a tragedy. He was the curator of her silence. He leaned his forehead against her knee, closing his eyes. The irony was a bitter weight in his chest. He could manipulate the national economy, he could crush rival syndicates under his heel, and he could command thousands to die for his name. Yet he could not perform the one miracle that mattered. He could not make her see him. He was the most powerful man in the country, but in this room, he was a beggar. He looked up at her profile, illuminated by the rhythmic flash of lightning. If she would only turn her head, if she would only let a single spark of recognition flare in those hollow eyes, he would set the very building they stood in on fire just to keep her warm. The rain intensified, a dull roar against the glass citadel. Ji-wook stood up, his jaw tightening as he reached a silent, jagged resolution. The doctors said she was a lost cause, a biological machine with a broken processor. His advisors told him to move her to a private facility and focus on the encroaching war with the Huang Syndicate. But as he watched a single drop of rain race down the window, mirroring a tear that Thalassa wasn't capable of shedding, he knew the truth. His empire was built on the premise of absolute control, yet he had never been more powerless. This billion-dollar view was a lie. If the world had to burn so she could find her way back to the shore of the living, he would be the one to strike the match. The Iron Architect was ready to tear down everything he had built. He didn't need a kingdom. He needed a smile. He stepped back into the shadows of the room, his mind already beginning to dismantle the throne he had spent a lifetime constructing, calculating the exact cost of a miracle. The news of the Incheon's surrender rippled through the city like a seismic tremor. cracking the foundation of the underworld's perceived order. In the days that followed, Kang Ji-wook did not scramble to repair the damage. Instead, he methodically began to tear the rest of the structure down. He sat in his glass office, but the phone lines that usually buzzed with requests for mediation or threats of retaliation went unanswered. One by one, he signed the divestment papers. He sold his majority shares in the steel mills to a shell company in Singapore and transferred the titles of his high-rise developments to a rival faction that had been gunning for his neck for a decade. He was liquidating his life's work with the cold, surgical precision of an accountant, but the currency he was trading in was blood and influence. His inner circle was the first to fracture. His captains stood in the doorway of his office, their faces masks of confusion that were rapidly curdling into resentment. They had bled to win these territories, and now their boss was handing them over like scraps of waste. Ji-wook ignored their protests, his eyes fixed on a small photograph of Thalassa on his desk, taken before the world went silent. He knew that every asset he signed away was a layer of armor stripped from his body. Without the steel mills, he lost his political leverage. Without the docks, he lost his supply lines, and without the towers, he lost the high ground. He was becoming a man of flesh and bone in a world that only respected titans of stone and fire. The confusion among his enemies did not last long. In the ruthless ecology of the Seoul underworld, weakness was a scent that traveled faster than a bullet. The initial shock turned into a ravenous hunger. Small-time street gangs began to harass his remaining men, testing the perimeter of a kingdom that no longer had a king. The police, who had once looked the other way for a hefty fee, suddenly found their courage now that the bribes had ceased. Ji-wook watched it all from his thinning fortress. He saw his security detail dwindle as men realized there was no future in serving a master who was intentionally destroying his own throne. He was not just losing money, he was losing the invisible shield of fear that had kept him safe for 20 years. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting long, skeletal shadows across his empty office, Ji-wook felt the first real chill of vulnerability. He walked through the halls of his tower, hearing the echoes of his own footsteps where there used to be a chorus of subordinates. The silence was prophetic. He had stripped himself of his titles, his wealth, and his protection, leaving him exposed to every blade he had ever dodged. But as he entered the penthouse and found Thalassa sitting by the window, the chaos of the outside world felt distant and inconsequential. He knelt beside her, noticing how the fading light caught the gold of her hair. He had traded the safety of an empire for the slim possibility of a cure, and as the sirens began to wail in the streets below, he knew the wolves were finally at the door. His rivals were no longer confused. They were closing in, emboldened by the realization that the Iron Architect had turned his back on the world. Ji-wook reached out and touched Thalassa's hand, his grip firm despite the storm gathering outside. He had dismantled his throne to build a bridge back to her, and even as his protection vanished and his enemies prepared to feast on his remains, he felt a strange, terrifying peace. He was no longer a king, but he was finally a man with a destination. The air inside the penthouse had grown thin, stripped of the bustling activity that once acted as a buffer between Thalassa and the harsh realities of the city. As winter settled over Seoul, a biting frost began to creep across the perimeter of the floor-to-ceiling windows, mirroring the cold isolation that was settling into Ji-wook's bones. He had successfully dismantled his financial empire, but the cost was manifesting in ways he hadn't fully calculated. The specialized medical staff he once employed had fled as the paychecks stopped and the threats from rival gangs intensified. Now it was just the two of them in a vast, echoing fortress of marble, while the heating system struggled against a city grid that no longer prioritized the Moretti Kang Tower. The evening was shattered not by a gunshot, but by a sound that tore through Ji-wook's soul. A sharp, jagged gasp from the armchair by the window. He dropped the basin of warm water he had been carrying, the splash echoing like a thunderclap. Thalassa, who had spent years in a state of tranquil suspension, was suddenly trembling. Her eyes, usually as still as a frozen lake, were darting frantically across the darkened room. Her breath came in short, panicked hitches, and her fingers clawed at the velvet upholstery of her chair. It was a moment of neurological distress, a storm in the mind that the doctors had warned might happen if her environment became unstable. For the first time since the accident, she wasn't absent. She was suffering. Ji-wook rushed to her side, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "I'm here, Thalassa. I'm right here," he choked out, reaching for her hands. But as he touched her, a sudden violent vibration rocked the building. From the street below, the muffled sound of an explosion reached their height, followed by the distant, rhythmic smashing of glass. The safe world he had spent a decade constructing was being picked apart by scavengers. Without his private security force to guard the lobby, the lower floors were being looted, and the high-tech dampening systems that once kept the city's chaos at bay had been deactivated. The vibration triggered a fresh wave of panic in Thalassa. She let out a low, guttural moan, her head thrashing against the headrest. He realized then the terrifying paradox of his sacrifice. By liquidating his power to buy her cure, he had removed the very shield that kept her world quiet. The penthouse was no longer a sanctuary, it was a target. The wolves weren't just at the door, they were inside the walls, and the tremors of their violence were leaking into Thalassa's fragile consciousness. He pulled her into his arms, shielding her body with his own as the lights flickered and died, leaving them in the oppressive gray of a winter twilight. Her small, shaking frame felt like a bird caught in a gale. He had thought he could trade his throne for her soul, but he saw now that the transition was a blood-soaked bridge. The cold began to seep through the vents, smelling of smoke and wet asphalt. Ji-wook held her tighter, his tears hot against her cold neck. He had stripped himself of his guards, his technology, and his influence, leaving her exposed to the very trauma he was trying to heal. He looked at the darkened skyline, realizing that the Iron Architect had failed his final project. He couldn't keep her safe in a palace that was falling down around them. If he was going to save her, he couldn't wait for a surgeon to come to them. He had to carry her out into the cold, through the fire and the rubble of his former life, and find the light on his own. The realization was a freezing clarity. The kingdom was dead, and the survival of the woman he loved now depended solely on the man he was without it. He began to pack a small bag, his movements fueled by a desperate, renewed ferocity. The scent of ozone and expensive cologne had long since been replaced by the acrid stench of gasoline and betrayal. Kang Ji-wook stood in the center of his crumbling sanctuary, listening to the heavy thud of tactical boots echoing through the hallway. These weren't the clumsy footsteps of rival street gangs. These were his own men, trained by his hand and paid by his blood. At the front was Minho, a lieutenant Ji-wook had raised from the gutters, now holding a silenced pistol with a gaze that held no room for sentiment. To them, the Iron Architect hadn't just weakened, he had committed the ultimate sin of the underworld. He had become a romantic. They saw his devotion to Thalassa not as a noble sacrifice, but as a terminal illness that threatened to take their livelihoods down with him. "You should have sent her away, Chairman," Minho said, his voice echoing in the hollow penthouse. The flickering emergency lights painted the room in staccato bursts of red. "The board doesn't want a martyr for a king. We want a boss who values the empire over a memory." Ji-wook didn't answer. He didn't waste breath on men who measured worth in territory rather than soul. He simply tightened his grip on the small tactical medical kit strapped to his waist and moved toward Thalassa. The first shot whistled past his ear, shattering a vase of dried gardenias, but Ji-wook was already in motion. He didn't reach for his gun. He reached for her. With a strength born of pure, adrenaline-fueled desperation, he scooped Thalassa's fragile form into his arms, tucking her head against the crook of his shoulder. He kicked through the side service door just as a flashbang detonated, the white-hot light blinding his pursuers for a precious heartbeat. He knew this building better than the men who were trying to kill him in it. He ignored the elevators, which were now death traps controlled by the security desk, and lunged into the concrete throat of the service stairwell. Behind him, he heard the roar of an incendiary device. The coup wasn't just an assassination, it was an erasure. His lieutenants were burning the tower to the ground to ensure that nothing of the Moretti Kang legacy survived the night. Smoke began to curl up the stairwell, thick and black, as the temperature rose with terrifying speed. Thalassa remained limp in his arms, her eyes wide and reflecting the orange glow of the encroaching fire. She didn't scream, but her fingers bunched into his shirt, a subconscious reflex that gave him the strength to keep descending. His lungs burned, and his muscles screamed as he bypassed the 40th floor, then the 30th, his boots pounding a frantic rhythm against the metal steps. The air became a soup of soot and heat. On the 21st floor, the door burst open and a mercenary stepped out, but Jiwook didn't stop to fight. He used his momentum to shoulder charge the man into the railing, hearing a sickening crack before continuing his descent. He was a force of nature, a man stripped of his titles and left with only the weight of his heart. By the time he reached the ground floor, the lobby was a war zone of shattered glass and licking flames. He burst through a side exit into the freezing Seoul night, the sub-zero air hitting his lungs like a spray of needles. He didn't look back as the Moretti Kang Tower, his life's work, and his gilded cage turned into a vertical funeral pyre against the winter sky. He staggered toward a nondescript black sedan hidden in a nearby alley, his shirt scorched and his hands bleeding from the glass. He placed Thalassa into the passenger seat with the tenderness of a man handling a dying ember. As he pulled away, the rearview mirror showed the silhouette of his empire collapsing in a rain of sparks. He had nothing left. No money, no men, and no home. He was finally just a man, driving into the darkness with a broken woman and a dream of a smile, while the world he built turned to ash behind him. The winter wind howled through the narrow, rain-slicked alleys of Seoul's underbelly, a place where the neon lights of the upper world never reached. In a basement apartment that smelled of damp concrete and copper, Kang Ji-wook stripped off his blood-soaked shirt. The reflection in the cracked mirror was no longer that of the Iron Architect. The sharp, tailored suits were gone, replaced by a nondescript black hoodie and tactical gear that had seen better days. His ribs were a mosaic of deep purples and angry yellows, a testament to the 3 weeks he had spent living as a ghost. He was no longer a man who moved pieces on a board. He was a man who broke the board across his knee. He looked over at the mattress in the corner where Thalassa lay, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket, her breathing the only steady rhythm in his chaotic world. To the public, the death of the Moretti Kang Empire was a headline that had already turned into yesterday's news. To the underworld, Jiwook was a cautionary tale, a king who had lost his mind for a shadow. But in the darkness, Jiwook was more dangerous than he had ever been as a CEO. He had spent the last fortnight hunting. The surgery required 3 specific components: a proprietary neural link chip, a stabilized dose of a synthetic neurotransmitter, and a localized EMP dampener to protect Thalassa's brain during the procedure. None of these could be bought with the money he no longer had. They had to be taken from the black sites and private laboratories he had once helped fund. He was a predator now, stalking the very shadows he had helped create, using the intimate knowledge of his own former supply chains to dismantle them from the outside. Tonight, he was after the neurotransmitter, held in a fortified clinic owned by a subsidiary of the Wang Syndicate. He moved through the ventilation shafts of the facility with the silent grace of a man who had forgotten how to fear death. When he dropped into the laboratory, he didn't use a silencer. He used his hands. He was efficient, brutal, and terrifyingly fast. He moved with a singular, chilling purpose that unnerved the guards who tried to stand in his way. They saw a man with nothing left to lose, a creature who had shed his humanity to become a vessel for a single goal. He didn't steal anything else, not the cash in the vault, not the data on the servers. He took the small amber vial, tucked it into his vest, and vanished back into the night before the sirens could even begin their mournful wail. Returning to the safe house, he knelt by Thalassa's side. The adrenaline was still humming in his veins, but his touch remained as light as a summer breeze when he brushed a stray hair from her forehead. He was a nameless man now, stripped of his history and his pride. But as he looked at the components lined up on the scarred wooden table, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. A cold, hard certainty. He was the only person in the world who could save her, and he would do it by burning every bridge he had ever crossed. He checked his watch. The window for the surgery was narrowing. The Huang syndicate was closing in on his location, their scouts already sniffing around the perimeter of the district. He didn't care. He was a predator in a city of wolves, and he was finally ready to lead the lamb to the shore. The air at the Huang syndicate's mountain retreat was thin and tasted of pine and impending ozone. Kang Ji-wook stood at the center of a helipad, a solitary figure draped in a tactical coat that looked more like a shroud than a garment. In his arms he held Thalassa, her head lolling against his shoulder, her existence a fragile flame he was shielding from a hurricane. Surrounding them was a literal army, black-clad mercenaries with high-caliber rifles trained on his heart. At the top of the stone stairs stood Chairman Huang, a man who had spent a lifetime trying to outbuild the Iron Architect. He looked down at Ji-wook with a mixture of triumphant malice and genuine bewilderment. He couldn't understand why a man who once held the keys to the city would stand in the snow, bleeding and broken, for a woman who didn't even know his name. "The surgeon is ready, Ji-wook," Huang called out, his voice amplified by the cold mountain silence. "But the shipping routes weren't enough. The towers weren't enough. You have one thing left that I want, the location of the Ghost Reserve." The Ghost Reserve was the ultimate myth of the Seoul underworld, a massive, untraceable stockpile of gold and digital currency Ji-wook had salted away for a rainy day. It was enough to fund a private war or buy a small country. It was his final insurance policy, the only thing that ensured he would never truly be poor. Ji-wook didn't hesitate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted drive, tossing it into the snow at the feet of the nearest guard. "The keys are on that drive," Ji-wook said, his voice a rasping blade. "Take it all. Every last gram of gold. Just start the surgery, now." Huang gestured, and a team of medical orderlies rushed forward, taking Thalassa from Ji-wook's arms. For a split second, as her weight left his body, Ji-wook felt a chasm of vertigo, a sudden realization that he was now truly, utterly nothing. He watched them carry her into the high-tech medical wing, the doors sealing with a heavy, pressurized hiss. He turned back to face the army, his hands empty, his empire gone, his secret reserves surrendered. He was a man with no tomorrow, standing on a slab of concrete in the middle of a winter storm. "She has 1 hour," Huang sneered, pocketing the drive. "After that, my men have instructions to ensure the Iron Architect never leaves this mountain. Consider this your final sunset." Ji-wook didn't plead for his life. He simply pulled a pair of serrated combat knives from his belt, the steel catching the dying light. He wasn't fighting to win anymore. He was fighting for time. He planted his feet as the first wave of mercenaries closed in, their orders clear. Kill the man, keep the money. The confrontation was a blur of silver and crimson. Ji-wook moved with a primal, desperate fluidity, a ghost haunted by the memory of a smile. He took hits that would have felled a lesser man, a shallow slice to his thigh, a blunt force trauma to his ribs, but he didn't falter. Every second he stayed upright was another second the surgeon had to re-knit the frayed tapestry of Thalassa's mind. He was the dam holding back the tide of death, a solitary barrier between the woman he loved and the monsters who wanted his legacy. The snow began to fall in heavy, silent flakes, sticking to the blood on his knuckles. He was surrounded, a circle of steel closing in, but his eyes were fixed on the red light above the medical wing's door. He was a man who had traded a kingdom for a miracle, and as his vision began to blur from exhaustion and blood loss, he felt a strange, transcendent joy. He had nothing left to give, no secrets left to sell, and no titles left to defend. He was just a man holding a line, a predator protecting his mate. The dam was breaking, the weight of the army pressing against his chest, but as the red light finally turned to green, Ji-wook let out a ragged, triumphant breath. He had held on long enough. The price had been paid in full, and as he collapsed into the freezing white, he knew that for the first time in his life, he had won a war that actually mattered. The salt air was thick and sweet, a bracing contrast to the sterile, metallic scent of the mountain clinic that had nearly been his tomb. In a remote coastal cottage where the floorboards groaned with the weight of the tide, Kang Ji-wook sat by a bed draped in sun-bleached linen, The scars on his face had begun to silver, and his left arm hung in a heavy sling, a permanent reminder of the price he had paid on that helipad. He looked older, the iron architect, replaced by a man whose edges had been weathered down by grief and exhaustion. For 3 weeks, since the surgery had been completed, and he had dragged his broken body and his sleeping wife to this edge of the world, he had lived in a state of suspended animation. He didn't check the news. He didn't care that the Huang Syndicate had been cannibalized by the very ghost reserve he had surrendered. He only watched the rise and fall of Thalassa's chest. The morning sun began to crawl across the room, illuminating the jars of sea glass and the simple wooden furniture. It was a humble life, a world away from the 60-story towers and the armored convoys. Jiwook reached out with his steady hand, his fingers trembling only slightly as he touched the pulse point at her wrist. Suddenly, the rhythm changed. The stillness that had defined her existence for 3 years shattered like a thin sheet of ice. Her eyelids fluttered, struggling against the weight of a long, dark winter. Jiwook held his breath, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his scarred ribs. He didn't move. He didn't want to startle the miracle he had bought with his own blood. Thalassa's eyes opened, and for the first time, they weren't the color of a frozen sea. They were deep, clear, and focused. She blinked against the golden light, her gaze wandering over the simple ceiling, the open window, and finally, settling on the man kneeling beside her. Jiwook felt a wave of terror, a fear more potent than any he had felt facing an army. He was a stranger now, a battered ghost of the man she had once known. But as her eyes locked onto his, the fog he had fought for years finally pulled back from the shore. Her hand, once limp and cool, twitched on the linen, her fingers searching for his. "Jiwook," she whispered. The sound was small, a fragile thread of melody that cut through the silence of the cottage. But to him, it was a symphony. It was the first time his name had been spoken with love in 1,000 days. She didn't ask where they were or what had happened to their empire. She simply looked at his battered face, her eyes filling with a sudden, radiant clarity. A small, tentative smile touched her lips, the smile he had burned a kingdom to see. It was a light that made the neon of soul look like dim, flickering embers. He leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers, his tears finally breaking free and soaking into the pillow. He had lost his shipping routes, his towers, his gold, and his reputation. He was a man with nothing but a cottage by the sea and a body that would never fully heal. Yet, as Thalassa's fingers curled around his, anchoring him to the present, the Iron Architect realized he had never been more powerful. The throne was gone, the crown was ash, and the world had forgotten his name, but he was no longer a predator wandering the shadows. He had traded a world of glass and steel for a single word and a radiant smile. He was no longer a king, but as the tide whispered against the shore, Kang Jiwook knew he had finally, truly come home. The cold, salt air of the Sicilian coast was quickly replaced by the stifling, dust-choked darkness of the villa's hidden marrow. Elena's heart felt like a trapped bird beating against the cage of her ribs, the rhythm so loud she feared it would betray her position through the very stones of the walls. The summit had dissolved the moment Marco's gaze had shifted from the waitstaff to the woman in the midnight blue gown. It hadn't been her face that gave her away, but her hands, the instinctive way she had reached to steady a wobbling glass on a passing tray, a movement born of 3 years of muscle memory. In that split second, the Countess had vanished, and the maid had been unmasked. Now, the hunters were in the halls, and the noose was tightening. She pressed her back against the rough limestone of a narrow service passage, the silk of her dress snagging on the ancient rock. This was her world, the invisible veins of the estate that the guests never saw, yet tonight they felt like a labyrinth designed for her execution. Above her, the muffled thud of heavy boots on marble echoed through the vents. She heard Marco's voice, no longer smooth and diplomatic, but sharp with the jagged edge of desperation. He was ordering the men to seal the exits and quiet the witness. To them, she was a leak to be plugged. To Lorenzo, she was the only truth left in a world of lies. Elena moved with a ghostly silence, her fingers tracing the mortar joints she had once scrubbed. She knew that 3 paces forward would lead to a loose panel behind the library, but the sound of splintering wood told her the traitors were already there. She pivoted, her skirts rustling like a warning, and descended a spiral stone staircase that led toward the cellar. The darkness was absolute, smelling of damp earth and fermentation, but she didn't need light. She had navigated these corridors in the early morning hours for years, eyes closed, memorizing the tilt of every floorboard. A flashlight beam sliced through the gloom behind her, dancing across the dust motes like a searchlight. "She's in the walls!" a man shouted, the sound echoing and distorting in the narrow space. Elena broke into a frantic run, her lace gloves tearing as she scrambled through a low-clearance crawlspace used for the plumbing. The contrast was agonizing. She was wearing a king's ransom in sapphires while crawling through the filth of the underhouse, a stark reminder that no matter how high Lorenzo elevated her, she was still the girl beneath the floorboards. She reached the iron grating that looked out into the kitchen, catching a glimpse of the chaos above. The staff were being rounded up, their faces pale with terror as Marco's men demanded to know where the ghost had gone. Elena realized then that the mansion she had once cared for was now a living trap. The secret passages were no longer a refuge. They were a funnel leading her toward a corner from which there was no escape. She could hear them closing in from both ends of the gallery, the metallic click of handguns being readied. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps. She had spent her life trying to be invisible to avoid notice, but now, her invisibility was the only thing keeping her head on her shoulders. She reached the final door, a heavy oak panel that led back to Lorenzo's private wing, and prayed that the man she had saved was waiting on the other side of the wood, with more than just a fountain pen in his hand. The Don's private study, just as a flashlight beam swept the corridor behind her. The room was bathed in the ghostly blue light of the moon, casting long skeletal shadows across the Persian rug where the hitman's blood had already dried into a dark, permanent stain. Elena leaned against the door, her breath hitching in her throat, her midnight blue silk gown shredded and stained with the soot of the crawlspaces. She was safe for a heartbeat, but the silence of the room felt wrong. It was thick, expectant, and carried the faint, sweet scent of lavender water. It was a scent that didn't belong to Lorenzo, nor to Marco, nor to any of the rugged men who patrolled the estate. It was the scent of the nursery. Elena moved toward the desk, her eyes scanning the shadows. Lorenzo was gone, likely led away by a false report to the north wing, leaving his heart, his ledgers, and his legacy unprotected. On the desk sat a small leather-bound diary she had seen 1,000 times while dusting the bedside tables of the family wing. It belonged to Sophia, Lorenzo's younger sister, the woman he had shielded from the sun and the storm alike. With trembling fingers, Elena opened the book. The pages weren't filled with the musings of a sheltered debutante, but with cold, precise dates and dollar amounts that mirrored the betrayals Elena had overheard in the hall. The final entry was dated tonight. It wasn't Marco who was the architect. He was merely the hammer. The blueprint had been drawn by the person Lorenzo loved most. Sophia hadn't been a victim of the family's violence. She was the one directing it, tired of living in the shadow of a brother whose mercy she viewed as a weakness that would eventually destroy them all. Elena felt a coldness settle in her marrow that had nothing to do with the drafty hallways. The last Judas wasn't a soldier or a rival, it was the blood in his own veins. A floorboard creaked behind her. Elena spun around, her sapphires catching the moonlight. Sophia stood in the doorway to the private balcony, a small, elegant pistol held in her gloved hand. Her face, usually so soft and kind, was a mask of aristocratic indifference. "You were always too observant for a maid." "Elena," Sophia whispered, her voice like velvet wrapped around a shard of glass. "A ghost should know when to vanish. If you had stayed in the shadows, you might have lived to see the new dawn I am building for this family." Elena looked at the girl she had once brought tea to during bouts of feigned illness. She saw the absolute lack of remorse in Sophia's eyes and realized that the warning she had given Lorenzo in the mirror was only half the story. The real threat was still coming, and it was carrying a tray of poisoned love. Elena knew that if she screamed now, Sophia would pull the trigger, and the sound of the ballroom music would drown out her death. But if she stayed silent, Lorenzo would walk into this room, see his sister, lower his guard, and die with a smile on his face. She looked at the gold-framed mirror, seeing her own battered reflection, a maid in a queen's rags. The debt of mercy she owed was a heavy one, and as she heard Lorenzo's familiar, heavy footsteps approaching the door, Elena made her choice. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She stepped forward, positioning herself between the sister and the door, a human shield for a monster who had once chosen to be kind. "Don't turn around, sir," she whispered to the empty air, bracing herself for the final strike of the clock. The door groaned on its hinges, and Lorenzo stepped into the room, his coat dusty, and his expression a frantic mask of relief when his eyes landed on Elena. He didn't see Sophia standing in the velvet shadows of the balcony, her pistol raised with a steady, lethal intent. "Elena," he breathed, his voice breaking the stillness. "I thought the halls had swallowed you." He took a step forward, but Elena moved with the speed of a strike, thrusting herself into his path, her back to Sophia. She saw the confusion in his obsidian eyes, and then the sudden, sharp realization as he looked past her shoulder to see his own sister holding a weapon. The air in the room froze. Sophia didn't fire. The sight of her brother's genuine grief seemed to paralyze her for a heartbeat too long. In that second, the guards Lorenzo had brought with him swarmed the balcony from the exterior, disarming the princess of the Valerius bloodline before a single shot could shatter the silence. The purge that followed was a whirlwind of steel and shadow. The estate, once a place of order and polished silver, became a theater of absolute reckoning. Marco was found at the gates, and the other conspirators were dragged from the darkness they had tried to weaponize. Throughout it all, Elena remained in the study, her midnight blue gown torn and her sapphires dull in the gray light of the approaching dawn. She watched as the man she had saved became the monster the world feared, issuing orders that would end the lives of those he had once called brothers. When the sun finally broke over the Sicilian cliffs, the traitors were gone, and the house was quiet once more, but the silence was stained with the weight of a family destroyed from within. Lorenzo returned to the study as the first golden rays touched the gold-framed mirror. He looked aged, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by the betrayal of his own flesh and blood. He sat in his leather chair, the same one where this nightmare had begun, and looked at Elena. She was standing by the window, the maid who had become a countess, the ghost who had become a shield. He reached into his desk and pulled out a thick envelope and a set of keys. "There is a car waiting at the service entrance," he said, his voice a hollow rasp. "The envelope contains enough to ensure you never have to scrub a floor again. You can go to Rome, to Paris, to wherever the Valerius name is just a whisper in the wind. You saved my life, Elena. The debt of mercy is paid in full. You are free." Elena looked at the envelope and then at her own hands. They were no longer the hands of a girl who knew only how to clean. They were steady, marked by the grit of the secret passages and the cold weight of the secrets she now carried. She looked at the mirror and saw the truth. If she walked out those doors, she would spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. She knew the names of the dead, the faces of the traitors, and the scent of a brother's heartbreak. She was no longer invisible. She was a witness to the soul of the Cosa Nostra. To leave was to wait for the day a different ghost found her in a different city. She didn't take the envelope. Instead, she walked to the sideboard, picked up the crystal decanter, and poured a single glass of scotch. She crossed the room with a measured, regal pace and set the glass on the desk before him. Then she pulled out the heavy chair opposite his own and sat down, smoothing the tattered silk of her skirts. "The ghost is dead, Lorenzo," she said, her voice a calm, unwavering blade. "I know too much to be free, and you are too alone to be safe." She looked him directly in the eye, no longer a servant, but a partner in the dark. She accepted her seat at the table, realizing that in this world, the only way to survive the fire was to be the one who held the matches.